Elias Varga watched the clock's cold precision. The woman barely met her father's faceless portrait. He made a mental note of the time-stamped footage. In Elias's world, emotions were stewed out like city streets. The tape hiss filled the room with Sellers' voice. Elias's heart still ached from the memorial service. "Mr. Varga," Junior said, "have you ever felt what it means to truly grieve?" Mira leaned back slightly, her eyes drifting closed. Junior listened with an intensity bordering on desperation. Like and subscribe for more stories like this one. Elias Varga watched the clock, a cold precision in his gaze as he timed the man's daughter leaving the memorial room within 9 minutes and 22 seconds. The woman barely met her father's faceless portrait before exiting to catch her appointment on time, perhaps a business lunch or dental cleaning. Regardless, grief wasn't part of her day's schedule. He made a mental note of the time-stamped footage for later correlation with his own database. Elias had been tracking this phenomenon for 3 years now. The eerie flatness in public mourning spaces. The analyst in Elias chalked this up to a systemic issue, the Bureau's emotional smoothing patches. He'd spent countless hours running regressions on the data, trying to isolate the variables, and with each successive generation, Elias himself being part of Generation 4, the effect grew stronger. He exited the funeral home and walked the rain-slick streets to his apartment. Elias inserted a data chip into his computer and accessed the registry reader software. After punching in the ID numbers he'd copied earlier, he waited for the results to load. The display flickered, then presented him with an updated profile of his own emotional metrics over time, a visual representation of his grief's diminishing amplitude. He frowned at the graph, tracing the flattened curve with a finger. 11 seconds today, down from 4 minutes last year. How much longer before he felt nothing at all? Elias knew every citizen carried a subdermal regulator, but somehow he'd managed to keep his own offline and unpatched since Sellers' death. He wondered if anyone else had done the same, kept alive the visceral sting of loss in an increasingly numb world. He sighed heavily and leaned back into his chair, the dim glow from the monitor casting shadows on his face. If only others could see this, could understand that beneath the Bureau's soothing lies about ending human suffering, they were erasing what made life worth living. Elias had tried to warn them through fringe forums and underground networks, but no one wanted to hear it. He closed his eyes, letting the silence of the apartment envelop him. In his mind, he heard Sellers' voice, a fragment from their old arguments, when she'd call him out for hiding behind data instead of feeling. "What's the point of having all that information if you don't use your heart?" she would say, her tone teasing yet laced with exasperation. Elias smiled faintly at the memory. He needed to feel again that visceral ache of grief and longing which had begun to wane in him over these past years. Tonight, he let himself remember, even if only for a few precious seconds, long enough to taste the salt of his tears before the smoothing patch took hold once more. He reached out to the analog tape drive beside him, thumbing the switch to life. The machine whirred into action and spooled up the tape, ready to play back Sellers' voice, the only thing that could still pierce through the numbness Elias had been trying so hard to maintain. The tape hiss filled the room and Sellers' laughter burst through, warm, alive, untamed. Elias closed his eyes, letting himself be enveloped by her presence once more. On the edge of tears, he whispered, "I miss you." And the words felt strange on his tongue after so long without saying them. As the recording played on, Sellers' voice grew softer, but her message remained unchanged. She was always pushing Elias to live in the moment, to embrace the chaos and beauty of human experience. But as he listened now, Elias couldn't shake off the weight of time, of loss, and the cold comfort of his own regulator. The tape ended abruptly, leaving him sitting alone in the dark apartment, the silence deafening. It was a fleeting respite, a momentary reprieve from the constant hum of Meridian City's emotional smoothing. Yet it felt like an eternity since Elias had last allowed himself to feel such naked vulnerability. He rose from his chair, walked over to the small window overlooking the street below. The city lights blurred as he rubbed his eyes, trying to blink away the tears threatening to spill. What would Mira think if she saw him now weak, broken? But then again, what was left of Elias's strength without Sela? He turned back to face the room, his gaze falling on the small pile of papers and drives scattered across the table, a makeshift archive of his own research into the patch system. The more he learned about its inner workings, the more convinced Elias became that something fundamental had been stripped away from humanity, something essential to what it meant to be alive. And Mira shared his suspicions now, her observations of patients who couldn't seem to mourn or remember their losses with any real depth. Together they were gathering evidence of a sinister design, one that sought not merely to alleviate suffering, but to eradicate the very capacity for human emotion itself. As Elias sat back down at the table, he noticed Mira's message on his data pad, a brief query about an upcoming palliative care symposium in Oldhaven. He hesitated before responding, unsure how much of their own findings they should share with others who hadn't yet experienced the same sense of loss and betrayal. But then again, what was the point of uncovering these truths if not to expose them? To warn others who might still have a chance to resist this slow erosion of humanity's emotional core? Elias typed out his reply. Mira, I'll meet you at Oldhaven Station tomorrow. Come prepared with data from your patients and anything else you've collected on the patch system. Before hitting send, he paused, listening for any signs that the Bureau might have infiltrated this tiny corner of resistance. But there was only silence, the distant hum of Meridian City's emotional smoothing. Elias pressed the send button, feeling a mix of trepidation and resolve. Tomorrow would be a turning point, a chance to share their findings with others who still felt deeply enough to care. And if they failed, if the Bureau continued its relentless push for continuity, then at least Elias could take solace in knowing he had tried, that he'd fought to preserve the last remnants of genuine human emotion. He looked down at the datapad, now glowing with Mira's reply, a simple thumbs-up emoji. And though it seemed like a pitiful gesture against the backdrop of an entire city numbed by smoothing, Elias felt a spark of hope kindle within him, the first he'd experienced in years, because for one fleeting moment he believed they might just succeed in breaking through this emotional veil and reclaiming their humanity. Elias stared at the screen, pulse quickening, as he waited for Mira's response to his message. His heart still ached from the memorial service earlier that evening, seeing the daughter of his old colleague walk out so soon after her father's death. Feeling it himself, but only faintly now. The smoothing patch always seemed to come at just the right moment, dulling the pain into a manageable ache before he could truly let go. But tonight was different. Tonight, he felt the absence of Sela more sharply than ever before, a void that had nothing to do with his own regulator's dampening effect. It was as if he'd been given a glimpse of what life might have been like without smoothing, raw, unfiltered, painfully beautiful. And now there could be no turning back. He reread Mira's message on the screen. I'm in. Then, an image began downloading, a series of anonymized regulator logs, each one representing a patient who had died recently. Elias recognized them, the same names he'd seen before, the ones Mira had collected from her palliative care patients. Capacity for it. A soft knock sounded at his door. An early arrival from Mira, no doubt. Elias stood up, running a hand through his thinning hair as he made his way to answer it. But when he opened the door, it wasn't Mira who stood on the other side. It was Junior, the young Bureau compliance auditor. Mr. Varga, Junior said, holding out a datapad with a professional smile plastered across his face. I'm here for our scheduled wellness continuity check. Elias raised an eyebrow. He hadn't realized he'd been assigned a specific time slot. But then again, the Bureau liked its schedules and protocols, probably figured that if people got too used to having their lives run by clocks, they wouldn't mind so much when everything else was smoothed out of existence. Come in, Elias said finally, stepping aside to let Junior enter. The auditor's eyes flicked around the apartment, taking in the cluttered workstations and stacks of analog data drives, a stark contrast to his own sleek, sterile bureau issue equipment. "What exactly do you need from me tonight?" Elias asked, walking over to pour 2 glasses of wine, his first in years. "Well," Junior said, taking a seat on the couch opposite Elias's desk, "I understand that you've been conducting some independent research into the patch system and its effects." He paused for a moment, taking a sip of his own wine. It seemed to be a new development. The Bureau had never before acknowledged Elias's personal project, but he was too stunned by it all to protest. "Yes," Elias said finally, setting down his own glass uneasily. "That's correct." Junior leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Elias's with an intensity that made him uneasy. It wasn't quite anger, and yet there was something in those eyes that didn't seem entirely regulated. "Mr. Varga," the auditor said quietly, "have you ever felt what it means to truly grieve?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Elias hesitated for a moment before answering, partly because he wasn't sure how much Junior knew about his own past experiences with the patch system, partly because there was something almost desperate in that question. Finally, he spoke. "I felt what it's like to lose someone," Elias said slowly, "but I haven't felt grief in years, not since they started issuing these patches." Junior nodded, but didn't say anything else. Instead, he pulled out his own datapad and began flipping through the files Elias had uploaded earlier that night, a clear sign that the Bureau was more interested in this research than it let on. And then, just as Elias thought things couldn't get any stranger, Junior asked a question that made him sit back in surprise. "Mr. Varga," he said, looking up from his pad with those same unregulated eyes, "do you know what it feels like to cry?" The word felt foreign on Elias's lips, as if he hadn't spoken it aloud since before Seela died. "Cry?" Elias repeated slowly, the taste of the word still strange in his mouth, lingering in his mouth. And then, suddenly, a memory flashed through his mind, a scene from one of Seela's old recordings, where she was laughing so hard that tears streamed down her face. "It feels," he began hesitantly, "it feels like something bursting open inside you." He paused, searching for the right words to describe what came next, something raw and intimate that he'd almost forgotten existed. "It's messy," Elias said finally. "You can't control it or explain it. That's what makes it so terrifying. But at the same time, it feels like a kind of release, like you're shedding something inside you, and when it's done, you're lighter for it." He looked up from his hands to see Junior watching him intently, a look that was almost longing. Before he could analyze it any further, Elias heard a soft knock at the door once again. This time, it was definitely Mira. "I'll talk to you." Elias opened the door to find Mira standing there, her hair still damp from a recent shower. She looked tired but determined, the creases around her eyes deeper than they'd been that morning. "I just wanted to check in," she said softly, glancing over Elias's shoulder into the apartment. Her gaze lingered on Junior for a moment before shifting back to Elias. "He's still here?" Mira asked, nodding toward the young auditor. Elias hesitated before stepping aside and waving her inside. "Yeah, he surprised me earlier with a few questions." Mira frowned as she entered, her eyes flicking between Elias and Junior. It was clear she wasn't sure what to make of the boy sitting in Elias's living room, chewing gum with an intensity that suggested he was trying to calm his nerves. "What kind of questions?" Mira asked, her voice low. Elias led her over to where Junior sat, gesturing for them both to take a seat on the couch next to him. As they lowered themselves onto the worn cushions, Elias noticed how small and unpatched Junior looked compared to them, a stark reminder that he was in the process of losing his emotional regulation. "He wants to know what it's like," Elias said quietly. Mira raised an eyebrow, but before she could respond, Elias continued, "When we grieve." Junior swallowed audibly as if he'd been holding his breath, his eyes darting between Mira and Elias with an almost desperate intensity. "Yeah, that's it," he murmured, the gum popping in his mouth. "I mean, what does grief feel like?" Elias hesitated again, unsure how much to reveal in front of the Bureau auditor. But something about Junior's eagerness, combined with Mira's presence and support, made him decide to take the risk. It feels, Elias began slowly, choosing his words carefully. It feels raw and overwhelming. At first, it's like being hit by a wave that you can't see coming or control once it hits. He paused, looking at Junior intently, its messy emotions and thoughts swirling together into something chaotic and disorienting. Mira reached out to gently touch Elias's arm, a gesture of comfort that he appreciated, but also found a little unsettling given the circumstances. Like you're shedding something inside you, and when it's done, you're lighter for it. Silent affirmation of his words, and he nodded gratefully before continuing. You realize what you've lost, and why it hurts so much. It becomes personal, intimate. He glanced at Sella's photo on the coffee table, her smiling face a painful reminder of what he'd lost. Grief is like mourning someone who died twice, once in life, and again when their memory fades from your heart. Junior listened, his expression unreadable, the only movement a slight twitching of the corner of his mouth as if trying to form a smile. Mira leaned back slightly, her eyes drifting closed as she seemed to soak up Elias's words like a dry sponge. As the silence stretched between them, Elias became increasingly aware of Junior's unpatched state. He could sense the boy's emotions in a way he never had with Bureau citizens. And then, suddenly, Junior stood up, a jerky, abrupt movement, as if he'd reached some kind of breaking point within himself. Junior began hoarsely, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for something to hold on to. I think I understand now. He glanced at Elias and Mira with a look that was almost pleading. Can I stay tonight? Elias felt a pang of surprise mixed with a strange sort of pride. This young man, who had been so sure of himself only hours ago, was now asking for solace, for comfort. And in that moment, Elias knew he couldn't turn Junior away, not when the boy needed him most. Of course, he said quietly, nodding toward the narrow guest bed tucked into a corner of the apartment. Take the couch if you want, or you can share the bed with me. Junior's eyes widened slightly at the offer before quickly narrowing as if considering it. After a moment, he nodded curtly and headed for the better, decision that seemed to carry more weight than mere physical comfort. As they settled into their respective sleeping arrangements, Elias found himself lying awake long after midnight, his mind racing with thoughts of Junior, of what lay ahead, and of Sella's memory which still lingered so strongly within him. And then, just as he was starting to drift off, he felt a soft tap on his shoulder, a gentle reminder that in this world not everyone could afford the luxury of grief. He turned to see Junior standing there, bathed in the pale glow of the city outside Elias's window, a silent sentinel guarding the door to their small sanctuary. And as Elias gazed up at him, he realized that for the first time in years he wasn't alone in his sorrow, but instead had found a kindred spirit who understood the true meaning of loss and longing. The question now was whether they could find a way to protect each other from the Bureau's relentless pursuit of continuity, or if their defiance would ultimately prove too costly for them both. Only time would tell, though Elias suspected that with Junior by his side, even the darkest of futures might hold a glimmer of hope. As he lay there in the stillness of night, surrounded by the ghostly echoes of analog memories and the soft hum of rebellion brewing within him, Elias knew one thing for certain. He was no longer willing to let the Bureau dictate how he grieved. And with Junior's help, he would fight tooth and nail against their soulless pursuit of smooth citizens, no matter what dangers or heartbreak lay ahead. For the first time since Sella's death, Elias felt a spark of determination flicker to life within him. Elias's fingers drummed an uneasy rhythm against his thigh as he watched Junior navigate the labyrinthine data archives. The young auditor's eyes, normally glazed with bureaucratic complacency, now shone with a fervor bordering on desperation. Come on, Elias muttered under his breath, willing the kid to find something, anything that could crack the Bureau's impenetrable facade of continuity. Junior glanced up from the screen, a furrowed brow creasing his forehead. I'm getting close, I think. These old files are encrypted like hell, but He trailed off as Elias's gaze drifted to the analog tape player humming softly on his desk. Seller's voice still echoed through the speakers, warm, teasing, full of life. The memory was a bittersweet solace in this cold, sterile world where human emotions had been systematically stripped away. "I need to see her again," he said quietly, not realizing how the words slipped out until Junior's questioning gaze flicked up to meet his. "See who?" the kid asked, his voice laced with confusion. "Seller, my wife." Elias's throat tightened as if a rusty gate was grinding open, allowing long, stifled emotions to pour through. "I need to remember her like this, real and full of life before the Bureau stole their grief, smothering it beneath a suffocating blanket of continuity." "I've got something," Junior exclaimed, snapping Elias out of his reverie. The kid leaned in closer as he read from the screen, voice hushed with excitement. Elias felt his blood run cold as realization dawned. This was it, the master plan to eradicate human emotion from society. But who was behind such a sinister endeavor? And why did their names seem so familiar? "Look for Director Halvard Dorn," Elias instructed sharply. "He's got to be involved." Junior nodded, fingers flying across the keyboard as he searched for any mention of the man in question. After several tense moments, the kid sat back with a grimace. He's still alive and active in the Bureau. Apparently, he's some kind of visionary, convinced that eliminating grief is the key to a utopian society. Elias snorted. A utopia for whom? Robots? But here's the thing. Junior paused, as if choosing his words carefully. Dorn's also credited with designing the initial patch system, and it seems he's been tweaking it over the years to achieve even greater control over citizens' emotional responses. "So," Elias said slowly, piecing together the horrifying implications, "the more people who get patched, the less they can feel anything genuine, even joy." Junior nodded solemnly. He trailed off, letting the weight of his unspoken conclusion hang in the air. Elias felt like he'd been punched in the gut. The truth was too ugly to comprehend, but he had no choice but to face it head-on if they hoped to uncover the full extent of this continuity nightmare. "We need to get a copy of Dorn's design notes," Elias said, his voice firm with resolve. "If we can expose his plan and how the patches are engineered." Junior's eyes lit up with understanding. "We could finally prove that the Bureau's been lying about their intentions all along. And if people realize they've been living in a world where emotions have been systematically suppressed." Elias let the thought trail off, envisioning the chaos or liberation that might ensue. "We'll need to move fast," Junior warned. "The more we dig into this, the higher our chances of getting caught. And if Dorn finds out what we're after..." Elias clenched his jaw. Let him try. In that moment, as he stared at Junior across their makeshift data lair, Elias knew they were both in this for the long haul, no matter how dark or dangerous the road ahead might become. Together, armed with nothing but a stubborn refusal to let their humanity be erased and the faint hope of uncovering truth amidst the Bureau's labyrinthine lies, they would forge ahead into an uncertain future, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them, for Sela, for themselves, and for the memory of what it meant to truly feel alive in this soulless city. Elias's eyes scanned the rows of data streams on his makeshift war room, a jumble of Bureau telemetry, encrypted messages from Mira in the field, and their own analysis outputs. It was a mess, but it was theirs. Mira's data suggest a spike in smoothing strength among younger recipients. He paused, noting Junior's reaction, an uneasy frown. "You're thinking what I'm thinking," Elias said, cutting through his own hesitation. "We need to talk to him, face to face. Find out just how deep this goes." Junior nodded grimly, already punching commands into the comms console. "I'll get us clearance for a meeting at HQ. Let's hope it doesn't take long." A few tense moments later, the screen lit up with an official Bureau icon. "Director Dorn's office," came the crisp voice on the other end. "Please confirm your identity and purpose." Cleared his throat. "This is Tomas Reyes, Compliance Auditor, Bureau of Continuity. I've been monitoring Elias Vargas' case." The line cut off abruptly. A moment later, it rang again. this time with a different voice. "Mr. Varga, Director Dorn here. We've been expecting you." Elias felt his stomach drop, but he kept his tone even. "Expecting me?" "Yes. Your unique situation has come to my attention." Elias heard the soft click of a glass being set down, followed by silence that stretched out like wire tightened between them. "I believe we have much to discuss," Dorn finally said. "Can you and your associate make yourselves available at HQ tomorrow afternoon?" The line went dead before Elias could reply. Junior glanced up, his eyes wide with unspoken questions. Elias shook his head, his mind racing with possibilities. "What do you think he wants?" Junior asked quietly. "I don't know," Elias admitted, "but I doubt it's an invitation to tea and crumpets." He let out a breath, the weight of their situation settling around him like a shroud. "Tomorrow then," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Junior nodded resolutely, a glint in his eye that Elias recognized as determination. As they parted ways for the night, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that their fates and the future of Meridian City itself hung in the balance, waiting to be decided by Director Halvard Dorn and whatever secrets he harbored. Little did Elias know just how deep those secrets ran, or what devastating truth awaited them both in Dorn's office the next day. Elias slept fitfully that night, his mind a jumble of data and dread as he replayed the conversation with Dorn. The director's calm assurance had only heightened Elias's unease. Something about the man seemed too smooth, like polished stone concealing rough edges. When Junior arrived at Elias's apartment the following afternoon, he found his friend hunched over an ancient desktop computer, screens flickering with lines of code. Elias glanced up, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and long hours poring over data. "I've got something," he said, voice hoarse. "It explains why Sella died." Junior's eyes widened as Elias showed him the Bureau's internal medical files, Sella's name highlighted in red. The diagnosis was a rare, aggressive cancer, but there was no mention of her removing her regulator or experiencing any withdrawal symptoms before her death. "This isn't possible," Junior said, brow furrowed with confusion. "I accessed those records myself. There should be something." Elias shook his head grimly. "The Bureau has ways to sanitize data. Dorn wants us to believe Scylla died of natural causes, so we won't suspect the regulator had anything to do with it." "But why keep it secret?" Junior asked, a note of anger creeping into his voice. "Because if people knew the regulators could kill them outright," Elias said, "there'd be chaos, panic. They'd revolt against the patch system and the Bureau's control over their emotions." He paused, his gaze distant as he stared at the monitor. "I think Dorn wants us to know Sella was the exception that proves the rule raw grief is lethal." Junior sat heavily in a chair beside Elias, his expression sobering. "So we're walking into a trap tomorrow, aren't we? Whatever Dorn has planned, it can't be good." Elias's eyes met Junior's, his voice dropping to a murmur. "I don't think he's going to let us out alive." He glanced back at the computer, where Sella's file was still open on screen. "But maybe that's what we deserve for trying to bring down the system." Junior shifted uncomfortably under Elias's intense stare. "What do you mean?" Elias sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to massage away the ache of his own guilt and rage. "I should have realized sooner the reason Sella took off her regulator, the cost she paid. It was for me. She gave up everything so I could feel again." His voice cracked. Junior's face softened with understanding, but Elias kept going, the words pouring out like a dam finally bursting. "I never thanked her for that sacrifice. I just took it for granted. I spent the rest of my life trying to hold on to what she died for, authentic grief, and now I realize how selfish I was. She gave me this precious thing and I wasted it." He swallowed hard. Junior reached out, placing a tentative hand on Elias's shoulder. "You weren't alone in your grief, Elias, and neither will you be tomorrow." His voice was steady, reassuring. Elias looked at him, his vision blurring with tears. "I hope that's true," he whispered, "because once we face Director Dorn and whatever he has planned for us, there may not be anything left of me to grieve." With that, he shut down the computer and stood up, a resolve in his eyes that bordered on desperation. They had no choice but to proceed. If they didn't expose the Bureau's manipulation of emotions today, who knew when or if anyone else would? And yet, as Elias squared his shoulders, preparing for the confrontation ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever truth awaited them was far more devastating than even he could imagine. Little did he know that Dawn had been expecting this moment, and had been quietly preparing his own response all along. Elias and Junior approached the director's office building with caution, their steps echoing through the sterile white corridors. They had to be careful. Dawn was known for his ability to read people, and they didn't want to reveal anything until they were ready. Elias glanced at Junior, who seemed surprisingly composed given what lay ahead. "Remember," he whispered, "you're here as a compliance auditor, not a rebel. Stick to your script." Junior nodded curtly, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Elias couldn't help but wonder about the young man's past, how he had managed to evade the regulator's smoothing influence for so long, and what secrets lay hidden behind that guarded exterior. They arrived at Dawn's office without incident and were promptly admitted by the receptionist, a woman with an unsettlingly calm demeanor, no doubt another beneficiary of the Bureau's work. Elias caught a glimpse of the director himself through the open door, a tall figure with silver hair and an air of quiet confidence that seemed to command respect. "Please come in," Dawn said, rising from behind his desk as they entered. "I've been expecting you." Elias felt a chill run down his spine at those words. How could this man possibly know what was coming? But then again, he had always possessed an uncanny ability to read people, a skill that had served him well in his data analysis days. "You sent for me?" Elias asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes," Dawn replied, gesturing toward the chair opposite his desk. "I have some information you need to know before we proceed." As they sat down, Elias couldn't help but notice that Junior seemed to be watching the director with an almost predatory intensity, a far cry from the nervous young auditor he had been just moments before. "What is it, sir?" Elias asked, his curiosity piqued despite himself. Elias felt a sharp pang in his chest. How did this man know her name? But then he remembered the analog tape the one Sella had left him before she removed her regulator. It contained a message for him alone. "What about her?" Elias asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. The words hit Elias like a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs in a stunned gasp. Dawn leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Elias with an intensity that made him shiver. "The cost of being human," he said, "of feeling truly alive." Elias stood in stunned silence, the director's words echoing through his mind like a dirge. He glanced out the window at the cityscape, meridians stretching out in sterile calmness below him. The last vestiges of Sella's warmth and teasing spirit seemed to whisper from his memory, she who had called him analyst, never allowing him to hide behind data or distance. He turned back to Dawn, anger and confusion boiling beneath the surface. "You're saying she chose death because she couldn't live with being half-numbed?" he asked, incredulous. Dawn nodded slowly, his voice calm as ever. She wanted to feel her last breath fully, the joy, the sorrow, the love without the regulator's interference. Elias clenched his fists against the ache in his chest. How could Sela have borne such a choice? What pain had driven her to give up life just to experience its final moments authentically? "And now you're trying to tell me that this is what humans need to be, half alive with regulators and patches?" Elias spat out the words, his voice cracking. Dawn's gaze never wavered. "Humans can endure much more than they believe," he said gently. "The patch system has saved countless lives from the ravages of grief, lives like yours." Elias felt like laughing, but it would have been bitter and despairing. "You call this living?" he asked, shaking his head. "Life is a balance," Dawn replied. "We've learned to manage the extremes to ensure our survival as a species." Survival. The word echoed through Elias's mind, a cold, impersonal term for existence, stripped of joy or sorrow, love or loss. He felt a sudden urge to smash his fist against the director's desk, then remembered it was merely an extension of the sterile office design. "Elias," Dawn said softly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries, "your wife loved you enough to let go of life itself so she could feel." The words landed like a punch, leaving Elias gasping for breath. He stumbled back from the desk, his vision blurring with unshed tears. "Enough," he whispered, and fled the office out into the rain-slicked streets of Meridian City. The cold water on his face only seemed to intensify the heat rising in his chest. He wandered aimlessly, lost in thoughts of Selah, the way she had teased him about his data headways, her laughter that could light up a room even in the darkest moments. He wondered if he'd ever truly known her at all, a question he couldn't answer now any more than he could back when she was alive. As night fell over Meridian, Elias found himself standing before an old brick building in the heart of Old Haven, their neighborhood, before the patch system took hold and smoothed out the edges of life. He remembered walking these streets, with Selah's hand in his, feeling the warmth of her body against his as they explored every nook and cranny. He raised a trembling hand to knock on the door, but it swung open without resistance. Elias stepped inside, finding himself in a dimly lit room that looked much as it had when he and Selah lived here, the same worn furniture, the same faded posters lining the walls. A figure moved out of the shadows, a young woman with dark hair and piercing green eyes. Mira Okonkwo. She'd been tracking his digital footprints for weeks now, since he'd posted that cryptic forum thread about grief metrics. "Welcome," she said simply, her voice warm as a hug on the cold day. "I've waited for you." Elias felt a spark of irritation at her calm demeanor, a contrast to the storm raging inside him. But it was quickly drowned out by exhaustion and despair. He sank onto the couch without waiting to be invited. "The director, Halvard Dawn, he knows everything about the patch system." "Everything?" Mira's eyes widened slightly, but her expression remained unreadable. Elias nodded, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. "Selah. She removed her regulator 2 weeks before she died. Wanted to feel her last moments fully." Mira's breath caught, and for an instant Elias thought he saw something akin to grief flicker across her face, but it vanished just as quickly. "Then we have no choice," she said firmly. "We need to expose the truth about Project Lethe, about what the patch system is really doing to us." Elias stared at her, his mind racing with the implications of their plan to broadcast Selah's recording, plus all that data through the Memorial Wall network during Continuity Day. It was insane, but also a desperate bid for sanity in a world gone numb. He looked up at Mira, and this time he saw no pretense of calm, only an intense conviction burning in her eyes. "We have a plan," she said softly, reaching out to touch his hand. "Together we can bring back the human." Mira's plan was daring but simple. On Continuity Day, when Director Dawn addressed the city with his usual soothing platitudes about the virtues of emotional stability and well-being under the patch system, they would hijack the Memorial Wall network. Elias nodded as Mira outlined their strategy, his mind churning through possible outcomes and risks. The broadcast would reach millions of citizens, some fraction of whom might experience a fleeting moment of genuine grief if Selah's recording and their own suppressed emotions were unleashed upon them. If they were lucky, the shock to the system could lead to unrest, public outcry that would force the Bureau to reconsider its policies. "We'll need to time it perfectly," Mira said, tapping on her tablet to examine the broadcast schedule. "Dawn always speaks at 8 m sharp. We have to hit the network before he starts talking." Mira's eyes were fixed intently on her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen as she worked out the final details of their plan. "We'll need to synchronize Selah's recording with the data from the patch system, make sure it all loads at once. Then we broadcast and pray that enough people see it to make a difference." Starts his speech right after midnight of Continuity Day. Marks the symbolic apex of emotional smoothing, when citizens are at their most docile. Elias grunted in agreement. He'd noticed that himself during the memorial services he attended, as a form of public mourning for Selah. People moved through their grief with mechanical efficiency, rarely lingering more than 10 minutes before excusing themselves to get back to work, errands, or their usual routines. The night air was heavy with anticipation as they made their final preparations, Mira uploading the recordings and data packets to a secure offline server, Elias verifying the encryption algorithms and timing sequences. Neither of them dared speak aloud. Their deepest fears that Dorn might have anticipated such an attack and had contingency measures in place, or that even if they succeeded, it would merely be a temporary reprieve before the patches were recalibrated once more. "Ready when you are," Mira said at last, her eyes gleaming with a fierce determination Elias found both admirable and terrifying. He nodded, took a deep breath, and initiated the upload sequence. The seconds ticked by in agonizing silence, until finally the network acknowledgement ping confirmed that their payload was live and ready to be broadcast, scheduled to begin as Director Dorn's speech reached its climax. Elias felt his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. He glanced over at Mira, who watched him with an unreadable expression. "Let's do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the server. Elias smiled grimly. "Focella." With that, they settled back to wait and hope that somewhere out there in Meridian City, as people felt their artificially flattened grief spike and burst forth like a dam breaking, the truth would begin to seep back into this numb world, a truth that might just save them all from becoming nothing more than hollow shells of what humanity once was. The hours crawled by in excruciating slowness as Elias and Mira waited for the appointed moment to strike. The server hummed steadily, its logs streaming live data on their payload's progress through the network. Every now and then, Mira would glance at her wrist, checking the countdown timer. 5 minutes, she whispered once, her voice barely audible over the whir of machinery. Elias nodded, his hands clenching into fists as he struggled to contain the churning mix of emotions inside him. At last, a soft chime sounded from Mira's device indicating that Director Dorn was on stage at Old Haven, preparing to deliver his annual Continuity Day address. The two looked at each other with unspoken understanding and shared a deep breath. Now or never. The clock struck midnight as they pressed the final command into the server. Across Meridian City, regulators began to malfunction in synchrony at Lich. No one could attribute to anything but an unforeseen network issue. In the streets, people screamed as they relived a lifetime of losses in a single blinding instant, their faces contorted by sobs, tears streaming down cheeks that had forgotten how to cry. Mothers wailed for children long dead. Fathers wept openly over spouses gone too soon. The once pristine boulevards echoed with anguished moans and desperate pleas as strangers embraced each other in a shared agony. In the auditorium where Director Dorn spoke, chaos erupted as the audience's grief responses spiked. The usually calm and collected man faltered visibly, his eyes widening in shock as he realized what was happening. He tried to regain control of the proceedings with practiced ease, but it was too late. The genie had escaped its bottle. As one, Meridian City's citizens felt their regulators' overload, their minds flooded by years of suppressed sorrow, rage, and longing for loved ones lost. For an eternity that stretched out like centuries, they were overwhelmed. And then, as abruptly as it began, the onslaught ceased. Across the city, a stunned silence fell, a silence broken only by ragged breathing and the occasional sniffle. People stood in the streets, blinking through their tears as reality slowly came back into focus, only to find that, once again, everything seemed normal. The evening air still felt crisp and clean. Traffic moved smoothly along the roads. Streetlights cast their gentle glow over sidewalks littered with discarded tissues and crumpled hankies. The only sign of what had transpired was the occasional sob or sniffle from someone who'd let their guard down for a moment, and even those were quickly swallowed by the city's usual hum of activity. Back at Old Haven, Elias and Mira stared blankly at each other as they waited for confirmation that their payload had been successfully broadcast. After what felt like an eternity, Mira's device chimed again, a message from their anonymous server indicating that every regulator in Meridian City had received the package. "It worked," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of Elias's heart. He nodded, his gaze fixed on hers as a slow smile spread across his face. "Seller," he said softly, and then he was crying again, sobbing openly for the first time in years. Mira's arms closed around him without hesitation, holding him close as they shared this moment of raw, unfiltered emotion, a luxury none of them had known existed until tonight. Together they wept their tears, mingling with those still falling from the faces of strangers across Meridian City, knowing that though their battle might not be over, at least now they could fight it with a weapon they'd almost forgotten. The truth. For Salah, for themselves, for anyone who'd ever felt loss and was silenced by the promise of continuity. They'd started this revolution in grief. Now all that remained was to see where it would leave them, and how far they were willing to go to reclaim a piece of their own humanity. They'd planned for every contingency except, perhaps, this. The city's sudden return to normalcy was as jarring as a cold shower. A night spent in the streets, feeling the weight of a nation's unshed tears and hearing their own hearts beat with something other than rhythmless clockwork. Returning to life under the patch was akin to waking from a vivid dream. The first indication of trouble came not long after dawn broke over Meridian City. Mira's device buzzed once more, a text from an unknown sender. She raised an eyebrow as she read it aloud. "Elias, you're being watched. Leave this area." The note was cryptic, the language oblique, hardly the stuff of a routine bureau warning. A chill ran down Elias's spine as he glanced around Old Haven's deserted streets. He couldn't shake the feeling they'd been followed here, that someone had been listening in on their conversation last night. "Let's move," he said gruffly, already heading toward their rendezvous point, the old cafe where Mira would meet him after her shift. Mira was already there when Elias arrived, a cup of bitter coffee steaming in front of her. She looked up as he slid into the booth opposite, a flicker of concern crossing her features before she masked it with a wry smile. "Mourning," she said, extending her hand to clasp his in greeting. It felt like grasping a lifeline, a tangible connection to a shared reality, one not mediated by the Bureau or their regulators. Elias squeezed back tightly, holding her gaze until they were both satisfied that neither of them had been repatched overnight, neither drugged nor improved into compliance. "It's time," he said finally, letting go of Mira's hand and reaching for his own device. He'd programmed it to automatically upload their broadcast data to a hidden server, a final safeguard in case they were both detained or rehabilitated. With any luck, that information would leak out eventually, proof enough to unravel the Bureau's carefully constructed narrative around the patch. The screen flickered as Elias initiated the transfer. It seemed to take an eternity for the progress bar to complete, the seconds ticking by with agonizing slowness, punctuated only by the distant hum of Meridian City waking up around them. At last the upload finished and Elias breathed a sigh of relief. They'd sent their message raw, unedited data that couldn't be easily manipulated or contained, and it would now find its way into the hands of those who could expose the Bureau's lies to the world. "Now what?" Mira asked, as if reading Elias's thoughts. Her voice was tinged with a hint of resignation, a tacit acknowledgement that their plan had only delayed the inevitable. They couldn't stay hidden forever. The Bureau would eventually find them and put an end to any lingering semblance of free will in Meridian City. "We've done all we can," he said quietly, his gaze drifting toward the window as a new day unfolded beyond its glass. "It's up to others now, to those who remember what it means to grieve and to feel." Mira's eyes followed his, her own gaze softening with understanding. She reached across the table, covering Elias's hand with her own once more, and for that brief, intimate moment, they were connected again. Two people navigating a world where emotion had been outlawed. Then she withdrew, standing up from their booth and shouldering her bag. "I'll see you tonight," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to break the spell between them. Elias nodded, his throat suddenly tight with unshed tears, a response he'd thought was long gone, but had found its way back in these past few hours. He could feel it building again, the familiar ache that threatened to consume him until he remembered Sela's voice on that tape, the one piece of her he still possessed, and the words she'd whispered before they lost each other forever. "I love you, Elias, more than anything. Hold on to me." He squeezed his eyes shut as a wave of grief washed over him, a feeling so intense it was almost tangible. And when he opened them again, Mira was gone, an ethereal figure dissolving into the crowd that thronged the streets outside, leaving Elias alone once more with nothing but memory and the promise of an uncertain future. And yet, with all of that, still something to live for. Mira was long gone when Elias emerged from his apartment. The streets were still congested with people in various states of emotional turmoil. Some wept openly while others hugged themselves tightly, faces contorted in confusion and fear. Elias moved through them like a ghost, numb to their suffering but aware of the chaos he'd unleashed. He walked for what felt like hours, his thoughts consumed by Sela's words and the knowledge that they were now out there, broadcast across Meridian City. A small part of him hoped anyone would find her recording, would hear it loud enough to make a difference. The rest of him didn't dare consider the consequences. Eventually, he found himself in front of an old, derelict building, a relic from before the grief accords had changed everything. It was here that he and Mira had planned their final gambit, the Old Haven Symposium, where they intended to expose the Bureau's true intentions with the patch system once and for all. Elias pushed open the creaking door, his eyes adjusting slowly to the dim light within. He spotted Mira near the back of the room, her regulator already failing, the telltale glow of an imminent crest in her eyes. "They're on to us," he said quietly as he approached, aware that time was running out for both of them. "The Bureau's tracking my telemetry. They'll be here any moment." Myra nodded curtly, her hand shaking as she fiddled with a small device on the table before her, a portable patch generator, capable of overriding the regulators in everyone within range. "They can't stop us," she insisted fiercely, though Elias could see the fear lurking behind her words. "I hope you're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper as he reached for the device. Together they set it to broadcast mode and activated it, and an instant later, Meridian City was once again flooded with Sela's warm, teasing laughter. Elias watched Mira as she listened, her eyes closing in rapture, as if she could feel every word of the recording, as if she were back there, standing beside him on that fateful night when they'd first discovered the truth about the patch system. And then it was over. The broadcast ended, and in its wake, a stunned silence fell across the room. Elias looked around at their fellow rebels, men and women who had lost loved ones to the Bureau's care and were now fighting back, and felt an overwhelming sense of pride and purpose. This was what mattered, he realized. This small group of people who refused to let the state dictate how they should feel. They would live on no matter what happened next, as long as there was someone left to carry the torch. But before that could happen, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hallway, a contingent of Bureau enforcers, here to arrest them and restore order. Elias knew that look in their eyes, the same cold calculation he'd seen on Director Dorn's face when they met for tea. "Mira," he said urgently, turning back to her, "it's now or never." She gave him a fierce smile, then grabbed the patch generator and dashed toward the door, a sprinter with death on her heels. Elias followed close behind, his heart pounding in his chest as he saw the enforcers closing in. They burst out into the night air, Mira already ahead of him by several feet. Elias could hear the shouts, the pounding footsteps growing louder, but it was too late to turn back now. They were committed just like he and Sela had been that fateful night when they'd chosen love over life. He felt a hand grab his shoulder, a Bureau enforcer trying to pull him back, and Elias turned, fury blazing in his eyes. He swung at the man's face with everything he had, feeling the satisfying crunch of bone beneath his fist before the enforcer crumpled to the ground. Then they were running again, Elias and Mira, a fleeting pair of shadows racing through the darkened streets as Meridian City burned behind them. They crossed into the unpatched zones on the outskirts, places where people still felt the last bastion of humanity in a world that had lost its soul to the Bureau's cold logic. and there they would stay hidden away from the prying eyes and regulators of their oppressors, a community of the brave who refused to let go of grief or life. Elias knew it wouldn't be easy. They would face hardship, persecution, and death. But with Mira by his side, he felt ready for anything. As they finally stopped running, breathing hard beneath the stars, Elias turned to her and saw tears streaming down her face, a woman who'd lost everything and yet still found a way to keep going. He reached out and took her hand, intertwining their fingers together as if that simple act could seal their fates for all eternity. And in that moment, he knew they would live on, not just as individuals, but as a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always something worth fighting for, something worth feeling. Because without grief and its attendant pain, we were truly nothing at all. Just machines living inside a world devoid of emotion, or worse yet, the false promise of endless happiness. Elias knew now what Selah had known then, that love wasn't about avoiding heartache, it was about embracing it, no matter the cost. And so they stood there beneath the night sky, a man and woman united in their defiance against the Bureau, ready to face whatever lay ahead, as long as they could do it together and feel